Hello. There's no need to adjust your monitors or your computer screens. This is the Flash. I hope all of you are doing well. You better hope I'm the Flash because um, I have to get through close to 50 slides in 45 minutes. Let's see how well I do. I don't know if I'll do that or not. My hope is that I'm able to be fast enough because I am the Flash. But if not, just forgive me and do your best. All right. So this lecture might extend into an hour because it's not the Flash that's giving you the presentation. It's actually Dr. Reyes. I hope all of you are well. This is the final lecture that I will be presenting in terms of assignments. It's going to cover chapters 7, 8, 10, and 11. And as I said, I will be as abbreviated as I possibly can, though, in all honesty, that's going to be tough. So, chapter 7 is all about alcohol and drugs as a social problem. Um, the chief premise for this chapter is that alcohol and drugs as a social problem are actually social constructs in terms of the norms and values and belief systems in the particular culture or society in which those drugs or alcohol are being used. Okay. So the basic idea around that is around the social construction of these issues of this problem with drugs and alcohol is that some drugs are actually quite normalized, right? So we have caffeine, a highly addictive substance, nicotine, alcohol, in Washington State, marijuana, and then you have other drugs that are criminalized, right? So methamphetamine, fentanyl, um, back in the past you had opium, heroin, those kind of drugs are criminalized. And the whole idea behind the social construction of drug abuse or social problems related to drugs and alcohol is what exactly is it that's used as criteria for the criminalization of drugs and what is criteria used for the normalization of drugs, right? So as your book mentions, and as it's discussed in our text, alcohol is the most widely used drug in the United States. It's a normalized drug. It has cultural sanctions and social sanctions and social approval in various degrees. We see commercials, we see it in its recreational use throughout our family, but we also do find that it has a profound impact on the broader society in terms of the problems that the legalization of alcohol has created, right? So the legalization of alcohol has certainly created problems that extend to, for example, DUIs, driving under the influence, people having their negligent homicide attributed to their actions because they got behind the wheel and they killed somebody unintentionally, but still, nonetheless, they've also created individuals because we've normalized the use of drugs. We have opportunities for potential violence within the homes, domestic violence, child abuse, suicide, all of these other different kind of things that are associated with. So alcohol use and drug use varies by age, by class, by gender, sometimes even by race. So for example, if you talk about the social construction of uh, of drugs and crack cocaine versus powder cocaine, right? Crack cocaine historically in the 80s and 90s, predominantly utilized in the inner city urban areas. Chief populations of use were ethnic minorities, African Americans, Black Americans, and powder cocaine, the drug of preference for the middle class suburban white kids, or white middle class professionals, right? So it does impact our families, it impacts our health, it impacts our work, and what we decide to normalize and legalize, and what we decide to criminalize, also has ramifications for the broader society. You know, the war on drugs is a really good example of that, right? We waged the war on drugs, and what we ended up with is a mass incarceration of less educated, usually predominantly minority communities of color, members of minority status, ethnic minority status. And so you end up with another problem, right? Where you have costs associated with the mass incarceration of a population. It is a public issue. While individuals may fall subject to alcoholism or drug addiction or substance abuse, um, and that certainly can be perceived as a social weakness or as an individual flaw in character. Generally speaking, there are social dynamics that contribute to the problem as a societal problem and not just an individualistic flaw or um, or weakness. All right, so now let's go on to the next slide. So, in terms of the sociological exploration, analysis, and evaluation of these problems, right, of alcohol and drug problems and why they occur, one of the chief theoretical frameworks is that related to structural functionalism. And the idea behind all alcohol and drug abuse or drug problems is related to the fact that there are structural problems that create a predisposition within individuals and kind of encourage some kind of escapism related to a problem that they're facing. So poverty, very frequently associated with it, stress, environmental stress, ecological stress, family stress, and then also inequality, right? So from a structural perspective, a structural functionalist perspective, some of the problems associated with alcohol and drug use or substance abuse is because of the ways in which institutions are operating. So, for example, the inequality, the racial and economic inequality in a particular society allows for people in inner city communities who don't have access to, for example, therapists, counselors, psychiatrists, or even psychologists, um, they have to do something with the traumatic stress that they're dealing with, right? And there is greater stress in poverties of economic in regions of economic poverty or economic disadvantage. So what do you do when you have all of these stressors in your life, but you don't have access to a therapist, a counselor, a psychologist, or a psychiatrist? Well, you have to look for some way to vent or express those traumas, right? And that stress, and that usually is through the highly accessible legal or illegal drugs in a particular community. So that's a structural explanation. There are also cultural explanations related to alcohol and drug problems, right? So there are norms that are associated frequently with alcohol use and other drugs. So, for example, the hazing rituals that generally have historically been associated with fraternities and colleges normalize the use of alcohol. Sometimes the family rituals, where mom or dad, grandma or grandpa are drinking a glass of wine, and then the media reinforcing continually this messaging of the normalization of alcohol. So you'll see some mainstream normalization with some drugs like alcohol, right, that are legalized, or nicotine, for example. You don't really see nicotine commercials anymore, but they used to certainly be very prominent in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Um, but there are also, with the illegal drug use, there are cultural norms also um, that lead to that, right? So especially with youth populations, youth populations generally pride themselves on being rebellious to mainstream normative expectations. Young kids don't want to always fall in line, so there's some cultural reinforcement of those messages there. There's also the socialization piece, right? So we have social reinforcement, we have peer pressure. Sometimes people feel pressured to engage in recreational drug use as a result of wanting to be accepted by their peer groups, wanting to fit in, right? Wanting to become members of a particular social group. And then there's also the learning dynamics associated with it, right? So in terms of symbolic interactionism and the idea behind stigma, you know, um, sometimes individuals are conferred a particular identity as a result of their drug use. That's called the primary deviance, right? And then if that primary deviance is strong enough, has a strong enough effect, it can become a part of the internalized sense of identity that a person has. So once an individual has been stigmatized with a particular identity, like a drug user, like a stoner, a crackhead, or whatever kind of pejorative terms have been used to label this individual, then that internalized sense of self becomes a patterned expression in the behaviors that the individuals begin to use and to basically express. Right. So going back to this idea of the theories related to alcohol and drug abuse or drug problems, the functionalism is definitely related to the broader structures in our society and the needs that individuals have. Conflict perspective looks at um, what dominant groups are in society and how those dominant groups get to label what is a criminal behavior or what is a non-criminal behavior in terms of the drugs or alcohol that are used, right? So dominant groups get to define what drugs get legalized, what drugs are criminalized. And you see that in the racialized patterns of the criminalization of crack cocaine and white powdered cocaine, right? And I use that example because it's a classic example of how heavily punished or heavily punitive the approach to crack cocaine was, and how different that approach was from the criminal justice system towards white powder cocaine. And the difference was a racialized difference because the users of white powder cocaine were traditionally and have historically been white middle-class suburban kids or white middle-class suburban professionals. Users historically of crack cocaine historically have been ethnic minorities and inner urban city communities, right? And the same thing with, for example, why we legalized or didn't legalize opium, right? We legalized alcohol, we legalized tobacco, because those were the drugs of the Western European, Euro Americans who arrived on North American territory and brought these patterns of behavior with them, these substances with them. So the idea also related to conflict theory and it overlaps with symbolic interactionism is like the meanings that are associated with particular drugs and alcohol, right? Like so. To give you a good example, why is it or how is it that we're supposed to respond to alcohol and substance abuse, right? Is it a medical condition? And that's where symbolic interactionism comes in. It's a labeling of how do we label alcohol abuse? How do we label substance abuse? How do we label some drugs legal? How do we label some drugs illegal? And then how do we make a distinction between a medicalized approach versus a criminalized approach, right? So does an alcoholic who's been given 3 WIs or 3 DUIs, does that person need medical help to break themselves free from the addiction, or do they need to be criminalized and sent to the criminal justice system, right? So those are the ideas associated with symbolic interactionism. All right, so now the consequences, right? So, in terms of the social consequences, there's family strain, there's economic loss. In terms of the health, you have overdoses, right? Fentanyl, heroin, all of these drugs are extremely dangerous for people. You have sickness, you have addiction, which again could be criminalized or medicalized. You also have inequality in the ways in which these drugs are policed and people are sentenced. And who gets treated for the illness or who gets treated for their use, their substance abuse, and who gets criminalized. And historically, who gets treated for their substance abuse is upper middle class individuals who have resources to leverage lawyers within the criminal justice system or some other supports that will create a medical condition as opposed to a criminal behavior. And then individuals and populations that don't have those resources, so they end up in a part of the criminal justice system. There are some harm reduction strategies. So the idea behind that is that we have rehabilitation, we have Alcoholics Anonymous, right? Like these kind of things. Harm reduction strategies also include, for example, needle dispensing. In case you're curious about like what kind of states would do that, Oregon actually did that with their heroin addiction, and I think it didn't necessarily pan out the way it did, but ideologically and theoretically, what they were hoping to do was cut down on the addictions and the illnesses that come when people share needles and people don't have places to legally and with some positive sanction be less stigmatized or destigmatized as a result of their substance abuse. So public health approaches have historically worked best. Your text mentions that, but the whole idea is that that's covered in chapter 7 is what we define as criminal substance abuse and what we define as medical substance abuse. What we define as legal substances and illegal substances is entirely socially constructed. And there are overlays related to the economics and the racial dynamics and the broader social inequality in our society and how we respond to that. In chapter 8 is all about norms and the idea of norms that are codified into law. So it's about crime. There are positive and negative sanctions that we apply to individuals who violate the social norms in our society. A codified law and a codified norm is, or actually a codified norm is a law. And the idea behind that is that there are some normative expectations that are so seriously taken by our society that we have punitive, criminal, and legislative sanctions to ensure that they're upheld and to ensure that those normative expectations are complied with, right? And that's what we end up with when it comes to laws, right? Crime. So to kind of go on here, we have civil legislation and we have criminal legislation. So we have civil laws and then we have criminal laws. So generally speaking, civil laws are if you ever see Judge Judy, that's what you're looking at when it comes to the courts. Civil laws are related to some kind of financial loss, individuals, businesses, some kind of harm associated with that. When we talk about the criminal justice system, we're talking about our criminal norms, legislative norms. We're talking about disruption of the public order, usually some kind of arrest and some kind of punishment or punitive approach to the to the action that's being brought up before the courts. Okay. Juvenile delinquency is a really important one. Things like underage drinking, going back to chapter 7, drug use, right? The idea of truancy being that individuals that are below adult age engage in criminal activity, and what we're supposed to do with them. So we have an entire system built around juvenile delinquency, because there are 14-year-olds that set other children on fire and end up taking their life of their peers, right? So, and this is the example that I'm giving you here. This young man, I forgot what his name was, but this young man was, I think he was 14 years old, and 3 or 4 of his friends set him on fire, where he had close to 90% of his body burned. And the question with juvenile delinquency is, well, what do we do with children, right? Because remember, the prefrontal cortex and the abstract reasoning and the executive function associated with the prefrontal cortex doesn't fully develop until, at least some of the research shows, until well into the late 20s. So that means, a lot of the inhibition, a lot of the impulse regulation and impulse control that adults have, young kids do not have, right? And this is not to justify setting a child on fire or shooting and killing someone or committing robbery or stealing or any of those kind of things are okay. But it is to bring into question, what do you do with a child who has taken the life of another person, but physiologically and biologically is not yet able to really reason through what they did, right? And so it's interesting that that's still being debated now. But going on, we have some distinctions that your book makes around street crime and corporate crime or white collar crime. So street crime is what you generally see more broadly represented in the news media and newspapers. There's some racial and ethnic overlays to that, and certainly economic overlays to that. So if any of you have ever watched the show Cops or The First 48, you'll notice that a lot of these representations within the media are predominantly urban environments, predominantly lower socioeconomically disadvantaged communities. So the cops don't show up on the TV shows in a upper middle class neighborhood or upper middle class neighborhood with a white collar professional that's having some kind of domestic violence situation. Generally speaking, you don't see those representations. And that's because street crime has a historical association with people in poverty, with racial and ethnic minorities. And there's a lot of questions around how there's over-representation, over-policing in some of these communities that is initially well-intentioned, right? So there's over-policing in communities of color and economically disadvantaged communities under the idea that they need more police in those communities because they're at greater risk of being harmed. But the other problem is, the flip side of that is that the more you enter, the more police presence there is in these communities, the greater likelihood there is of seeing and being caught up in the incarceration and the mess of some kind of crime being infracted, some kind of infraction or some kind of normative expectation being violated. And then you end up with basically a higher frequency or a higher rate of criminal activity being reported because they're in there's police there now, and the more presence, the more heavily present a police force is, the more likely it is they're going to start finding crimes that maybe would go undetected where the police presence less heavy. Okay. All right. So going on, there are some family patterns, for example, to street crime. Our prisons are filled, our criminal justice system, our incarceration systems are filled with individuals that are predominantly coming from single parent households, right? So there's a family dynamic to that. Although, it's not to say that if you're raised by a single parent family or in a single parent family, you're going to end up in the criminal justice system. It was true for me, right? But it's not true necessarily for a lot of other children raised in that single parent family structure. A hate crime is also one that's relatively new, and I say relatively within the last 15 years or so. But there's the idea that some states have laws that are on the books for hate crimes, and that's generally related to a race or ethnicity of a particular person. So anti-Semitic crimes, anti-Islamic crimes, racial or ethnic crimes associated with Hispanics or Latinos or Asian Americans, after COVID or during COVID, Asian American attacks were on the rise. They increased significantly. So Asian Americans were being assaulted and attacked because of what Donald Trump called at that time, President Trump called the Chinese virus, right? Which pejoratively attributed to one ethnic group this virus that came from that region now. All right, so going on, sometimes it's because of religion, some kind of religious persecution. Sometimes it's because of sexual orientation. So you find that members of the LGBTQ community, trans members, non-binary conforming individuals, um, non-conforming, non-binary individuals are greater at greater risk and more subject to violence or to attacks and being subjected to crime than individuals that are outside of that group. And I give you this picture here. This is a young man and his fiance. Shortly before he was murdered, he was a young man that he's a Mexican American who was undocumented. And in Shenandoah, Pennsylvania, I believe he was attacked by five white young teens, some young men that were high school seniors or juniors or something, and they killed him. And his whole story is fascinating because not only did they kill him because he was Mexican, but they also the police force actually worked to cover up the murder, and um, and almost got away with it, because the initial local case where all these children were brought to court and basically held in a jury trial. They were found not guilty for the murder of this individual. And it wasn't until the FBI and the federal level of intervention, the federal criminal justice system moved in and began to explore what exactly happened with this case, that it was discovered that the police covered up the murder and that there were motivations to and real a lot of social pressures to get these children off the hook for the murder of this individual. So long story short, hate crimes are another category. You have white collar crime, or what's called corporate crime. And the interesting thing is that white collar crime is very much frequently associated with deceit or concealment. So it's like stock market exchange, stock market fraud, the documentation, the falsification of particular documents related to business exchanges. So you have Bernie Madoff, which is part of a Ponzi scheme. You have the Enron executives here. Um, Usually, what's interesting is it's individuals that have higher socioeconomic status, higher levels of education, and as a result have access to the ability to actually deceive or conceal information that could get them in trouble. So Martha Stewart's a really good one, a good example of that. And the interesting thing is, though, even though there's a greater media representation of street crime as that's being the danger that we have, it's white collar crime that actually poses the greatest financial cost and loss to our society. It's upwards of billions of dollars. Okay. All right. To kind of keep going on, some examples of white collar crime or corporate crime could include employees who have their wages deducted, sometimes discrimination from employment, employers that engage in business fraud. The public sometimes is subject to falsified documents related to police brutality or toxic waste disposal. So a good example is what was it? There was a DuPont chemical manufacturer who poured a whole slew of very, very toxic chemicals into a particular property that they own. It seeped into the soil, it seeped into the water source beneath it. They sold the land, a land developer built houses on it, and then people got sick and started dying. And basically, cancer rates increased in these areas. I think some infants died as a result of it. And so there was this whole neighborhood built on this chemical waste plant, or waste refuse. And that's part of like white collar crime, right? When a chemical company dumps all these chemicals. Elon Musk company just got fined, I think $500,000 for doing the very same thing, just like 4 days ago. And then sometimes we have deceptive advertising, dangerous products, et cetera, et cetera. So that's also white collar crime. We have what's called victimless crimes, quote unquote. So victimless crimes could include illegal gambling, um, prostitution, drug use, right? Drug abuse, those kind of things. And going back to chapter 7, what is it exactly that gets labeled illegal criminal drug use? And what is it exactly that gets legalized in terms of drug use, right? They're generally victimless crimes are associated with consenting participants. So if someone chooses to use drugs, someone chooses to gamble, someone chooses to have sex with a prostitute, or a prostitute chooses to have sex with a client, et cetera, et cetera. Um, but there's a lot of question around whether or not there is really victimless crime. Okay. So our criminal justice system is made of basically a trifecta of layers. So you have the police, which are the thin blue line, they're the front line. You have our courts, and our courts are related to basically like mediating the outcomes of individuals who engage in violations of a normative expectations that are codified laws. And then we also have the incarceration system, which is usually associated with punishment, right? Like, what do we do once the police apprehend an individual, the courts find someone guilty, and we are going to punish them? The incarceration system is part of that process, and we're all subject to due process, right? And due process means that you should have a speedy trial, you have the right to remain silent, those kind of things. We also have double jeopardy laws in place. So there's that going on. And regarding punishment, one of the challenges we have is we can't build enough prison space to house all of the individuals that are part of the criminal justice system. I think there's something like close to 6 million people that should be incarcerated, but we only at any given point regularly incarcerate close to 2 million, 1.7 or something like that, 1.7 million people. The rest are actually out on probation or parole, which is unsupervised or maybe supervised, right? Probationary status. Okay. You have deterrence theory which is related to, like, okay, what exactly is it that makes individuals engage in crime? And the whole idea is that crime has benefits and it has costs, right? And so these crimes and these costs and these benefits are weighed out by criminals. And that was the whole premise behind the war on drugs. The war on drugs was predicated on the idea that if we punish crime heavily enough using deterrence theory, then individuals who want to use drugs will be so afraid of using drugs that because they're gonna go to prison for a long time. They're not going to use the drugs, right? And so Nixon and his war on drugs was initiated under the premise of deterrence theory, and really kind of hoping that by intimidation, people were going to be so scared of going to prison for 25 years that they wouldn't use drugs. Well, it turned out that our society called the bluff of the incarceration system and the criminal justice system, and we ended up with mass incarceration, right? We ended up with three strikes, drug laws, those kind of things. So when we talk about deterrence, we have two types of deterrence. We have general deterrence, which is basically, okay, we arrest you, we house you in a criminal capacity within an incarceration system like a prison or a jail. Once your time is served, we release you, hoping that your time out was sufficient to help you learn the lesson. There's also specific deterrence, which is related to, like you can see in these images, ankle bracelets, checking in with a parole officer or checking in with a probation officer. And the idea is that you're under supervision. You're still a part of the criminal justice system, but that because you're being supervised, you're less likely to recidivate or engage in recidivism, which is basically a reoffense of a particular crime. Maybe not the same kind of crime you committed to get into the justice system, but some other crime. Okay. All right. There's also an approach that is distinct from deterrence, right? Rehabilitation. So what's the whole point of what do we do with individuals who engage in criminal activity, right? Well, the whole point initially, right, is, and we have two responses: we punish or we rehabilitate, and we have a heavy leaning towards punish. We want to punish criminals, and we haven't necessarily spent as much time wanting to rehabilitate them. And so the criminal justice system has heavily moved towards one direction than the other, but there is some effort at various points in history towards the rehabilitation of criminals so that they don't reoffend, because we have very high rates of recidivism, which is individuals who end up being a part of the criminal justice system have some degree of likelihood of recommitting an offense once they get out. Because what happens in prisons or even jails is they don't learn anything. They're just kind of stuck there on a timeout. And they actually learn other behaviors that are probably not very productive for them in the broader society. All right. And I already mentioned this. So you have shock probation, parole, probation. Those are community-based forms of correction. So some of the theories associated with functionalism, Emil Durkheim isn't emphasized too heavily in terms of this chapter, but not all deviance, not all crime, not all normative violations are bad. And a good example is that there are some laws that are unjust, right? And the question is, what do you do with an unjust law, right? So Martin Luther King Jr. was like, that's an unjust law. I don't have to honor it. I'm going to challenge that law. And so he challenged the laws of segregation, right? He openly challenged racist laws. And so did women during the suffrage movement. Women who were denied the right to vote cast ballots and ended up being punished, right? So the idea behind deviance is that not all deviance is bad. Some deviance can actually foster a greater, more positive social change. And deviance has a positive effect of creating some kind of cohesion, social cohesion around individuals who don't offend versus individuals who offend, right? So it actually tightens the community. A good example of this is what happened on September 11th when we were attacked by the radical Islamists that crashed into the Twin Towers, right, in New York City and in other places, Washington, D.C., and the Pentagon. Their deviant act actually brought the United States together. Americans, Democrats and Republicans, independents, all of us came together as Americans, and really those nuanced differences, ideological, political differences, were set aside during that period of time in American history to some degree. So there are some laws that can be challenged. That's a functionalist perspective. Deviance does have positive benefits, because we have deviance, there are jobs for police officers, lawyers, judges, and probation officers, and chemical dependencies, substance counselors, all these other people. They get jobs because we have criminals, et cetera, et cetera. So anomie theory is a functionalist theory, and the whole idea behind this is that um, individuals experience strain or anomie as they try to attain the goals of the broader society in which they live. So the way that society is structured creates anomie, creates strain for individuals who are socialized to want to attain the goals or the means, the ends actually, through the means that are socially approved or socially sanctioned. So usually, if we're going to reach or attain the American dream in our society, we discourage people dealing drugs to get rich, and we want people to go to college to get the money and the education they need to acquire the dreams that they want for themselves, right? So all members of our society have the same goals and are socialized to the same goals. Which are basically the means and the ends, right? The means to get there are the ways we get to the goals. All of us are socialized through a particular set of social norms. And then the ends, which are the goals that we have, are also kind of universal to some degree. But they're now the cool thing about anomie theory is that there's different manifestations of it. There's different ways in which anomie reflects itself. So a couple of ways in which it reflects itself are these first three. So there are innovators, right? So some people experience strain in the means to the goal, in the means to get to the ends. They experience strain, frustration, anomie, and they accept the goals, they accept the ends that we have as a society for them, but they reject the means. And so what they do is they innovate, they create a shortcut to get the goals that they have. A good example of an innovator is a person in this class or other classes who's using ChatGPT to get an A, Now, of course, individuals that are doing that, they're not learning anything, they're not actually growing intellectually. A lot of research is already showing that their brains are probably stagnating, even though they're not aware of it, which basically reinforces the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? Um, and I'm not to say anything pejorative about individuals who are using ChatGPT, right? But the idea is they're innovators because they want the A. So they're like, I'm going to take a shortcut. I'm going to use this instead, right? Because studying takes too much time and that's too much work. To read that chapter is way too much. I can't do that. I can't write that paper. That's way too long. I don't even know those words, right? Those kind of things. So they innovate. They innovate and they end up at the goal. Now there are some challenges for that, as I share with you. First of all, when you innovate, you get busted a lot of times. And every quarter I catch individuals in this class and other classes using ChatGPT. Which, I would say I'm defending the integrity of everyone else's degrees. Because the last thing we want is a dumb person with a college degree. And although there are already dumb people with college degrees, we want to kind of minimize the number of dumb people with college degrees, right? So there's an innovator. There's also conformists. So conformists are individuals which is the majority of society. This is most of us. We are socialized to conform to the means and the goals that the broader society has. Okay. So we actually stay in line with the means and the ends. And that's and you know what? Sometimes the tragedy of it is because we're socialized to conform, sometimes we don't get the ends. So, for example, a person who doesn't use ChatGPT because they're socialized to believe that it's wrong, especially when they've already been told it's wrong and there's something in the syllabus that says it's wrong, they may not get an A, they get a C, or they get a B, or they get a D, right? So sometimes, and the same thing with the American dream. Some of us don't get to realize the American dream because we conform to the social means to get those goals and those ends attained, but they don't really work sometimes. because of the strain and the anomaly that we experience. There's also ritualists. Now, in ritualists, interestingly enough, they accept the means that society says. So it's an individual who's not chasing the American dream, right? An individual who's not chasing A's. So they accept the means, the way to get to the goal, but they're not chasing the goal. They're kind of just going through the motions. So those are the first three. The last two are retreatists and rebels. And I give you an example of like hippies, for example. These individuals on the left side are hippies. They reject the goals and the means of the broader society, and they basically stop engaging in social participation. You could also see a retreatist as a homeless person. Okay, a homeless person has rejected the goals and reject the means of the broader society. And then you also have rebels. Now, rebels like Ted Kaczynski are those who reject the goals and the means of society, just like a retreatist. But instead of just kind of stopping participation in society, the rebel tries to destroy the means and the goals that the society has. So Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, sent out bomb packages to various prominent leaders of various companies and organizations in an attempt to stop corporate expansion and environmental destruction, right? Okay. All right, so you have social control theory, which is associated with Travis Hershey. So the whole premise behind social control theory is that, you know, bonds weaken or strengthen one individual's likelihood of committing deviance. So social connections, social bonds, right? The stronger your social bonds and social connections are, the more likely that there's an effectual social control over you, and the less likely you are to engage in deviant behavior, right? So Travis Hershey identified four components associated with this theory. The first one is attachment to others and attachment to social expectations. And that minimizes your likelihood of deviance because you're attached to individuals who are going to basically socialize you towards conformity. There's also the degree of commitment to the relationships and the activities that you have. The more committed you are to the particular relationships you have and activities that you're being asked to engage in, the less likely you are to deviate. In terms of involvement, so you have to have some kind of involvement with socially approved activities. And I'll give you an example of this. So if you're a cheerleader, you're less likely to go out and do things that you shouldn't be doing because you have practice and you have adult supervision. If you're playing an instrument, if you're a member of a band, if you're an athlete, all of those activities are socially approved activities that have adult supervision associated with them. And that adult supervision increases your social capital and it makes it less likely for you to deviate because there's someone watching you, there's someone supervising you, there's some relationship that you're building, there's an attachment to that person, and there's also a commitment to the relationship you have. And as a result of your involvement in socially approved activities, you don't have any time or energy to do the things that maybe other people will do if they have the time or the energy to do. So individuals who are using drugs, recreational drugs or alcohol, may not have a lot of involvement in socially approved activities, right? So if you're getting drunk or if you're getting stoned, you're probably not playing soccer because you don't want to run and chase some ball. You don't want to kick a ball 100 yards and then chase it because you're stoned or you're drunk or you're high, right? So the last thing is you also have to have a belief. The last component to this is that there needs to be a real follow through in believing that what you're doing has value. What you're doing has value. The normative expectations other people have for you have value. The attachments you have to significant others have value. And the commitment to the relationships that you have has value. You have to believe that these things have value because if you don't believe these things have value, you're less likely to stay conformed to social norms and you're more likely to deviate. Okay, you're more likely to engage in criminal activity. All right. Differential association, another one. Now, this deviant theory, this criminal theory is interesting because differential association says that a crime is learned, and it's actually learned sometimes with conditions that favor violation of the law over compliance. So the idea is that illegitimate opportunity structures can present themselves to individuals, and individuals who have some degree of interaction with a significant others that socialize them to engage in criminal activity will ultimately be more likely to engage in deviant behavior or criminal acts versus someone who doesn't have those illegitimate opportunity structures present. Okay. So the whole idea behind differential association is the relationships that you have create conditions for you to be socialized to learn and engage in deviant behavior. Okay. All right. Um, so from a conflict theory, towards criminal activity, the idea is that some of the deviance and some of the crime that you see results from dominant group members who get to define what is criminal, right? So white Americans get to punish white powder cocaine less harshly historically, right, than crack cocaine. Um, laws against sexual harassment were not on the books until in the 1960s and 70s. More and more women started getting elected to legislative bodies and started passing laws against sexual harassment. So now sexual harassment is illegal, right? But when it's all men who are making laws, of course, men don't make laws against sexual harassment because men didn't, because men didn't see sexual harassment as a problem. It was only something that was subjected to the subjective experience of women. So the crime is historically defined by those in power. So a good example is we legalize alcohol, which is a highly addictive drug. And actually the drug of Euro Americans, the preferential drug of white Euro Americans, white ethnic Americans. And we penalize marijuana, or we criminalize marijuana historically, right? So, and that's because marijuana was historically associated with Mexican Americans and brown people in the South, right? So crime frequently from a conflict perspective results from broader social patterns of inequality that are economic, racial, and sometimes even gender. Okay. Chapter 10 is all about family. So this idea of a structural diversity model, which is families are also socially constructed, just like drug and social abuse problems. And they're socially constructed in the sense that we get to define what a family is, right? And who's included in the definition of a family changes over time. So we had anti-miscegenation laws. So society gets to say sometimes who we marry, right? We have laws saying that you can't marry a 15-year-old if you're 30. But we have laws that also say you can marry if you're 18 and you want to marry a 75-year-old, right? So society has a lot to say about family formation, who you get to marry, who you can have sex with, who you can have sex with, who you can't marry. So an anti-miscegenation laws are a good example of this as well. In the past, we had laws that said people could not marry outside of their race. So a black person could not marry a white person. Right? We had laws against same-sex marriage. So lesbians, gay individuals, homosexuals were not allowed marriage up until the 90s, up until 2000s, actually, to be honest. It wasn't until the 2000s that we started seeing some social acceptance of gay, lesbian, and homosexual relationships. Okay, homosexual family formation. All right, so and that changes historically, it also changes culturally. So family is, according to the US Census definition, right? Your family if you're related by blood, which is by birth, okay, by marriage, or by adoption, right? There is also fictive kin, which are basically sometimes, and we'll talk about it more, but individuals that, like, so for example, padrinos, if the godfathers, right? In some cultures, godfathers are are seen as family, even though they're not family by blood, marriage, or adoption, right? Generally speaking, the family is important because it transmits the values, the norms, and the beliefs of particular generations. And again, going back to this idea of the social construction of family, society has a lot to say about who you can marry and who you can't marry. Okay, and has historically had a lot to say about that. We have monogamy, which is a term that basically says that individuals have one partner or one spouse for a lifetime. It's increasingly rare. In the United States, we have the marriage go round, which is basically this idea that, and so monogamy is ideally, it's an idyllic kind of idea, which is very hard to attain. We more frequently in the United States have something called serial monogamy. So serial monogamy is this idea that we have many single partners over an extended period of time. Ben Affleck is a good example of that. He's been married multiple times. Jennifer Lopez has been married multiple times. Individuals who are monogamous in one marriage divorce and then enter another marriage relationship, a marriage contract, and stay monogamous to that relationship, and then et cetera, et cetera. So you have monogamy, which is idyllic or idealistic, highly idealistic, that you're going to stay with someone for the rest of your life. And especially when you have divorce, no fault divorce laws, all of these things. And then serial monogamy, which is basically, I'm going to stay monogamous with this one partner until this marriage or relationship ends and I go to another one. Okay. All right. We also have different kind of family forms. So going back to what I shared earlier, you have polygamy and you have polyandry. right? So polygyny is a specific form of polygamy, and that means that it's a husband who has several wives. You know, sometimes it's a result of economic need or material deprivation that this happens, but it is common in some Islamic nations and some regions of Africa. And you know, even in the United States, there's a really good show called The Sister Wives. Now that show is no longer as popular because you know the polygyny that was represented in that reality show. I mean, all the families got divorced, right? So it doesn't it's not a true pure polygamous relationship, but these are some other terms, right? Polyandry is when, and this is less common, but when a woman has several husbands, and that also may be due to the fact that there's a limited number of women in a particular region, so a woman has multiple husbands. All right, so you know, single parents are another type of family structure. There's a lot of research on some of the deleterious effects associated with single parent family structures, and there's a lot of research on what exactly is it that leads to these very adverse outcomes for children that are raised in these kind of family structures. And what you're looking at here on these charts, I'm not going to explain them, but it's basically like, does income account for the difference in child well-being? Because there's a lot of very harmful outcomes associated with being raised by a single parent. And these three pictures try to look at, is it income? Is it education and family? Or is it poverty, right? Like, what is it exactly like that's associated with why a single parent child is more likely to engage in, or more likely to be arrested, right? And more likely to engage in substance abuse, and more likely to have less educational attainment or drop out of school, or lower educational performance, right? So there's a lot of research that's still going on around that. There's another family form. So you have there's lots of different family forms, right? So you have the nuclear family, which has historically been a it's been depicted as a heterosexual family with a husband, wife, and then children. But you also have single parents. You have cohabitation, which is individuals who choose not to marry. This is certainly something that's more common now. And it's more common because there's been a change in cultural norms. It used to be that cohabitation was perceived as living in sin, quote unquote. Because the idea was you're supposed to marry that person. You're not supposed to hang them on a string and leave them hanging for an indefinite amount of time. So there's been some cultural shifts that have allowed for a normalization of cohabitation. There's less need for marriage for both men and women. You know, as more and more women are experiencing upward educational attainment, they're less likely to feel the pressure to want to marry. There's less of a stigma around singlehood. You know, it used to be that if you didn't get married, especially for females, if you didn't get married, you were basically leaving yourself out to become to not just to become single, but to become stigmatized through your singlehood, right? But that's not necessarily the case now. You know, we've seen cultural shifts that have destigmatized singlehood, and there are greater educational and economic opportunities that have presented themselves and allowed for people to not have to marry. All right, so you have cohabitation. Now, one of the challenges with cohabitation, though, is that if the relationship leads to the accumulation of resources or assets, when they separate, the courts have to step in. It gets pretty messy, right? Like, or if there's a child, whose baby is it? If there's a house, whose house is it? If there's a car, whose car is it? Whose TV is it? Right. So it complicates to some degree, and that's kind of where marriage makes it clean cut. Marriage, there's still tension around those divisions, right? But marriage allows for the legal system, the civil system to come in and really kind of sort that out. Cohabitation kind of makes that a little bit murkier. Okay. I will mention heterosexual, gay, lesbian, and bisexual relationships as well. So it's not, like I said, it's not up until recently that gays, lesbians, and homosexuals have been able to marry and have been allowed marriage across the country. There is, in same-sex couples, there's greater relational equality, and that's related to the fact that these couples have had to historically contend with dynamics of oppression, the five faces of oppression, in ways that have led to them kind of coming together and looking for greater equality within the relationships they have. Because they experience greater discrimination and have historically experienced greater discrimination and marginalization, um, they have kind of pulled themselves together. They have more effective conflict resolution, and has historically been less institutional support, although that is changing. Right now, you do have some churches that allow for a for same-sex marriages, gays getting married, lesbians getting married. You also have some shifts in education that have allowed for a greater representation of different family structures. So now you have Tango and Three, right, which is a children's book that has a penguin that has two dads. Me and My Two Moms is another children's book. So you've seen shifts in the educational system. You've also seen shifts in the legal system that have allowed for some of these relationships to be normalized through the process of normalization. So some theories related to family, you have structural functionalism. And the whole idea behind functionalism is that the family as an institution has certain functions, right? So the function of the family is the socialization of individuals, the social control mechanisms associated with socialization, and then also the procreation. So that the idea is that families are formed in order to sustain the survival and the reproduction of the survival of the society. Historically, from a functionalist perspective, there have been expressive needs that are historically associated with femininity and meeting the emotional needs that individuals have to be healthy, right? So like every person needs to be loved, cared for, needs to be encouraged, and needs to be dignified, right? And historically, that has been an expressive function of the mother, right? Or feminine expressions. And that's not to say that fathers can't express expressive functions, but men are socialized, right, in very different ways with association with masculinity that make it more and more difficult for men to engage in expressive functions. Okay. And that's slowly changing, but I'm a good example of that, but historically, from a functionalist theory, motherhood was associated with femininity and expressive functions. Um, Fatherhood was associated with masculinity and instrumental functions or task-oriented functions. And then one of the feminist critiques of that is that the expressive functions have historically been devalued in contrast to the estimation and the esteeming of instrumental functions that are associated with men. Okay. All right. So the family serves certain functions. Let me go back here. The family regulates sexual behavior. So it's within a particular family that we learn our sexual scripts, right? Who you can have sex with, who you can't have sex with, those kind of things. Where you can have sex, right? You can't have sex in the back of a car. I mean, maybe you can, but that's generally not where you want to have sex, unless maybe that's the only place that presents itself, right? The family function of reproduction, right? Society needs reproduction. So declining birth rates in China are one of the problems that China has because of its one-child policy. We're also seeing declining birth rates in the United States, which are going to be problematic for employment, for the economy, for the broader society in which we live. The family also serves as the function of socialization, which I already mentioned, and then also it runs in tandem with the economic institutions, with economic support of the individual members within the household. Another theory associated with families is conflict theory. So, in this perspective, it's not that conflict is bad, right? Like, I don't want you to think of conflict theory associated with domestic violence or child abuse, but conflict in this context is a resolution of diverging perspectives related to particular issues within the family. Um, Conflict theory is also related to the internal and external conflict that come into the family. So, for example, you have conflict internally within the family sometimes because of changes in the economy. So, for example, if a husband or wife loses their job, that external conflict, that external pressure leads to internal conflict within the family because now you have fewer resources to spread around. And so now you have conflict between the mom and the dad, or between the mom, the dad, and the children over um, whether or not you get cable, whether or not you have a phone, whether or not you get to buy that expensive makeup or whatever, right? So the conflict in the family is actually beneficial because it leads to resolution, it leads to progress, it leads to compromise, and it also leads to change. There's also conflict related to the statuses and the roles that we play. So, a husband, for example, and that's a status, right? Who is unemployed because of the shifts in the economy, they are experiencing role strain in that context because they're not able to operate and they're not able to work. That, of course, challenges their role performance, and that, of course, challenges the role performance of the wife, who may have to pick up a second job. And then you end up with conflict over the gendered expectations of behavior related to femininity and masculinity and instrumental and expressive functions. Okay. All right. So going on. One of the last theories associated with family theory is symbolic interactionism. And there's a lot of symbolism related to our families, right? So we all hold statuses, like I just mentioned. We have statuses like father and mother, child, son, daughter, husband, wife, right? A good example of the symbolism associated with families is this ring, right? This ring, it symbolizes a lot of different things. For me, it symbolizes the love that I have and the commitment I have to my wife. For other people, for example, it means I'm off the market, right? So if a woman is expressing interest in me, she sees the ring, she backs off because she recognizes that this is taken, right? Or maybe if she moves further towards me because she wants to take what's there, right? So heaven forbid that that would happen, but the idea is there's a lot of symbolism associated with the families, and what this theory says is that we engage in basically the performance, the role performance, the performativity associated with the statuses and the roles that we have to perform. Okay, the statuses we possess and the role expectations associated with those statuses, role performance, and very heavily associated with our identity. And a good example of that is, historically, marriage has been, the wife has been referred to as, in a pejorative sense, the ball and chain. Oh, you got the ball and chain, and you can see on this cake topper right here, right? The ball and chain being that, the idea being that marriage holds you down and it keeps you down in terms of your freedom. And the same is true for women. Women when they get married, once they become wives, they also are become encumbered by the weights and the obligations of wifehood. Okay. All right. So going on, some of the challenges associated with a family divorce, highly problematic, highly traumatic for all parties involved. Um, there's a lot of research that shows that divorce is extremely adverse in its impact on husbands, on wives, especially wives. There's a gender dynamic to that. A greater increase of likelihood of poverty, greater increased parental stress because now you're a single parent. And once a person divorces, there's a greater likelihood, increased greater likelihood of divorce in their second marriage. I mean, there's just a slew of different problems. For children, you have greater exposure and a greater likelihood and risk of vulnerability of substance abuse to cope with the trauma of the divorce of the parents. Because whether or not children say that they're hurting, a lot of times children internalize divorce as something that they helped cause, even if their parents say it wasn't about them. So children are walking around wounded as a result of divorce. And most of the time, they do a really good job of pretending, of hiding that from their parents. And they really kind of repress that trauma, which ultimately can lead to a manifestation of substitutionary coping behaviors that can be problematic. Maybe not substance abuse, but sexual addiction, food addiction, addiction to other things, and sometimes maybe suicidal ideation, some of these things that we kind of bump into. And then, the other thing too is that children that are raised in divorced households also have sometimes uh, a greater reluctance to engage in family formation themselves, delayed family formation, and then sometimes maybe periodic or serial divorce as a result in their own life. So you have interpersonal violence, intimate partner violence, which is IPV. You have challenges of child abuse, right? Sexual abuse, physical abuse, psychological abuse, all of those things. So some of the intimate partner violence that we talk about is intimate terrorism. So we have stalkers, we have battering, we have violent resistance, you have couple violence, lots of examples. Sometimes in the most extreme cases, you have femicide. And actually, all of these are extreme cases, but they're very, very common. Although I mean, you just have to look at the news and you see some of these things kind of presenting themselves all over the place. Chapter 11, which is the final chapter, and I'm almost done. So let's see if we can get this done. The whole premise behind chapter 11 is schools, education. And one thing I want you to keep in mind in this chapter is that schools are highly inequitable and they reflect broader patterns of social inequality in the broader society in which we live. And that's true of race, that's true of gender, that's true of economics, and that's true even of ability. And we've even passed laws to try to rectify, remedy, or inhibit some of the dynamics of discrimination, oppression, and marginalization that we know present themselves in school as a result of the broader social inequalities that we see. So, for example, in terms of race, we've passed the Bilingual Education Act, in 1965, and that was to support bilingual learners. It was also to support not just bilingual learners, but English language learners and multilingual learners. Um, and associated with the Bilingual Education Act, you had Title One, and Title One was a law that was passed to reinforce and support um, economically disadvantaged student populations, which had a racialized pattern to them. In terms of race, we have Brown versus Board of Education, and Westminster was another case. We have lots of different cases that are all race related, and they're laws that we've passed, they're policies that we've enacted and enforced to try to create a greater and more just educational system that we know doesn't exist currently because schools are sites frequently of cultural reproduction of inequality in the broader society in which we live. We've passed Title IX, which was addressed at really kind of countering sexual harassment and gender discrimination. Schools are gender training grounds. In schools, young women and young men, but more frequently young women, learn how to sit, how to speak, how to act as women and as men. And the problem with the gender dynamics of it is just think of who has historically gotten dress coded, right? Women are more subject to sexual harassment in schools. We have economic policies that we've enacted, as I mentioned before. Um, Title One, which was a policy at the federal level to try to provide resources, economic resources to economically disadvantaged populations who attend school that have a racialized pattern to them, right? Historically, ethnic minorities are concentrated with higher rates of poverty. So Title One was not just a racial response, but also an economic response to some of the racial and economic inequality in our society. You have the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which was also passed in the 1965 period, which was also a response to the civil rights movement and greater numbers of communities of color and people of disadvantage and marginalization advocating and wanting their voices to be heard. You have No Child Left Behind. You have the Every Student Succeeds Act. Um, you have all these different kind of economic policies, and then you also have laws that were really policies, and laws that were enacted to counteract discrimination against ability and ableism, right? So we have the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which is IDEA. We have Section 504, so children who have Down syndrome, IDEA. Children who have autism, Section 504, right? So children who have ADHD may fall under Section 504. So the thing I want you to see is that our schools are highly inequitable. They're funded differently, they're funded unequally. There are patterns of um, racial policing, so to speak, right? Like who gets sent to the office by teachers, who gets sent to the office because they're in the hallways, they're not enforcing, they're not complying with particular dress codes, et cetera, et cetera. And we have racialized patterns too, who gets suspended, who gets expelled. We have zero tolerance policies in our school, et cetera, et cetera. So the whole idea that I want you all to see is that that our schools are site of cultural reproduction generally associated with social, economic, racial, and gender inequality. Schools are very cold spaces for lesbians and bisexuals and homosexuals who are at greater risk of bullying, harassing, and even intimidation and assault. Here are some news stories to kind of highlight my point in case you think I'm just making this stuff up. On the right, you have Pasco High School. Pasco is about an hour and 15 minutes away from Yakima, but it's a high school, larger metropolitan area in the Tri-Cities where a young African American child, a young lady, was told by a white student, "Since when do slaves say no?" Um, and in this interview, this mother is saying like, this is racist, it's discriminatory, it's horrific, and all this child had to do is write a letter of apology, right? So we don't have laws to protect Black children from the racial microaggressions that they're going to have to experience as a result of a racist comment made by an individual. And so that kind of highlights that. We also, on the left side, we have Mexicans and MAGA wall for Halloween. So you had 13 teachers who dressed up as quote unquote Mexicans, whatever that means. And they wore sombreros, they wore ponchos, and they had a wall that said the Make America Great wall, the Trump MAGA wall. And they posted this on Facebook. This was 13 teachers. I think it was 13 teachers. It was in Boise, Idaho. And the crazy thing was that there was a GoFundMe page that was, or maybe not a GoFundMe page, but some page of support that was trying to get these teachers back into the school. They have a pretty sizable representation of Latino students in the school. So there you have two examples of racial aggression, racial microaggressions, harmful acts that are in school, and in each of them, basically the individuals who offended these kids, who hurt these kids, they just had to apologize. Which, I mean, an apology is something, but you have to think about like the harm that was done to these children, right? And the lifelong implications of that harm. Okay. What's the problem with our schools? So our schools suffer from high rates of innumeracy and high rates of illiteracy. So even though we send a child to school from kinder to 12th grade, which is about, right, 12 grades of school, almost 12 years of schooling, we still have a pretty sizable population of individuals who are illiterate, which is basically they can't read. And then also innumerate, which basically they can't operate functionally with math, right? They can't measure calories or do percentages or balance their checkbooks. Okay. So the question around the theoretical questions around schooling is like, what is the purpose of schools? So from a functionalist perspective, the purpose of schools is to promote social solidarity, that is to promote social unity, create greater social cohesion. It's to reinforce the existing social order, the intellectual, political, and economic social order that we have. So, for example, a good example of that is like we send children to school and we hope they can do things when they graduate that make them good employees, right? We hope that they go from the educational institution to the economic institution and they become productive in the economic institution. Um, we hope that they become civil and civic participatory individuals, civically engaged participatory individuals in our society. We hope that also there's some aspects of cultural or social mobility embedded in schools. We hope that children who are in the lower class are able to experience upward social mobility as a result of their educational training and as a result of the educational experiences they have in our school. So there's cultural improvements, social mobility, et cetera, et cetera. We have examples here of some of the purposes of schooling. You pledge allegiance to the flag, and then when you get an order, an executive order during World War II for the Japanese internment, the Japanese go with their children because they're patriotic, and they go to these internment camps. Okay, to their own detriment. All right, so from a functionalist perspective, there's also this idea of the hidden curriculum, that yes, we go to school, we send our children to school to learn the ABCs and one, two, threes, but we also learn other things, and that's called the hidden curriculum. So in school, we also learn obedience to authority or obedience to our parents, translates to obedience to our teachers, which should translate to our obedience to our employers. And that's the whole idea, right? That's the trifecta of the obedience of the hidden curriculum. We also learn a little bit about morality, right? So ethics, what's right, what's wrong. We should not cheat, for example, because if you cheat in school, then you're probably going to cheat when you're a police officer, or you have a greater likelihood of cheating when you're a nurse or a doctor, et cetera, or engaging in questionably ethical behavior, right? Or questionable ethical behavior. We also learn punctuality, right? So time is money in the United States. So those bells in our school program us to basically when we hear the bell, we pack up and we go to the next class, et cetera, et cetera. And the expectation is that we're going to be on time when we get to work, right? So you go to an interview and you're on time. What do they say? 15 minutes. If you're not 15 minutes early to an interview, you're late, that kind of thing. Okay. Our schools also have a more insidious dynamic associated with them, and that's called tracking. Now, the thing I want you to see about this is that tracking, it starts very early on in our school systems, and it's related to, for example, the identification of a learning disability or a learning problem, but also an exceptionality like a gifted and talented individual. And what tracking does is through the mechanisms that we have in place, teachers are the front line for the identification, the labeling, the testing, and the affirmation of a particular track that a child is going to go on. So you have gifted and talented tracks, you have special education tracks, and then you have general tracks. So they're usually the three tracks. There's also like a career vocational technical track, but those kind of blend into like one of those three. And tracking is associated with the curriculum. There's different types of curriculum in vocational educational training and in gifted and talented educational tracks, and also in special education tracks. So the type of preparation you receive, the exposure to the curriculum you have. There's also this valuation of um, like who's more intelligent, so to speak. Now that's the idea. That's not true, but that's the associations we make with these tracks. Um, but teachers have a lot to do with determining who gets promoted to the next grade, who gets placed into gifted and talented tracks. So historically, I'll give you a good example of how unequal and insidious this stuff is. Historically, racial minorities were overrepresented in vocational and career tracks. So that is like, as a Hispanic American, I was placed into vocational automotive technology. My homeboys were tracked into welding, carpentry, electrical engineering, maybe not electrical engineering, but welding, automotive tech, body shop. Females were tracked into cosmetology classes, where my white colleagues, my white classmates were tracked into the gifted and talented program, where they were tested into IB or AP courses. And that was a college prep track. So the kids on vocational track are not getting ready. They're not being prepared for college. They're being prepared for work. The kids in in gifted and talented classes, AP classes, they're being trained for white collar careers, generally speaking, on a career path, a college career path. Um, and guess who makes those distinctions? Teachers. Teachers have a lot to do with that. And sometimes the identification of a learning disability that leads to a child being placed into special education tracks. And historically, children who were ethnic minorities were overrepresented in the special education courses and underrepresented and continue to be underrepresented in the gifted and talented courses. Okay. All right. So I'm going to keep moving because, there's a lot more slides. All right. So the purpose of schooling, from a conflict perspective, it's the idea that schools reproduce inequality and they transmit very unequally the social, cultural, and human capital that is essential for upward social mobility and or essential for resource appropriation and resource allocation. Okay. And that's very much closely tied with the economic institution and the sorting and the tracking that takes place there. Okay. So last but not least, what's the purpose of education from some symbolic interactionist perspective? We have with this idea of credentialism, and the idea associated with credentialism is that credentialism is the diploma, the high school piece of paper that you get, or the college degree that you get associated with that. It's supposed to represent, right, some kind of functional literacy with the content subject matters that you've been exposed to and your ability to apply and practice the utilization of that knowledge in some kind of concrete way in the economy. Um, but there's questions around that, right? Because sometimes people graduate, especially now with ChatGPT, people can get college degrees and not know a damn thing. Pardon my language, right? And they don't know lick. They earn the credential, and then you sit them down and you ask them to explain Durkheim's social solidarity and the difference between organic and mechanical solidarity, and they look at you like a deer in headlights, and they realize, oh my God, I robbed myself of education, right? So the credentialism associated with symbolic interactionism is, what does a degree symbolize, right? It's supposed to symbolize the possession of human, cultural, and social capital that allows a person to be socially fluid and economically productive. But is that true? Right? And it's also associated with this idea of the meritocracy. A college degree legitimated the exclusion of various individuals from an opportunity at economic and social mobility, upward social mobility. Like, it legitimated the exclusion of various populations. And through the advent of AI, ChatGPT, and really just the influx of information that's out there, the meritocracy has really been challenged. Is the person that's a leader in an organization really the most competent and the most intelligent and the hardest working, right? Because that's associated with meritocracy. Remember, the meritocracy is the belief that you work hard, um, and you are rewarded for your hard work. You possess knowledge or information that other individuals don't possess. And as a result of that, you are afforded particular authority and discretion over decision making. Usually, the meritocracy is associated with a belief in a really rigid division of labor and a strict hierarchy, a bureaucratic, rational organization that makes decisions, not on emotion, but on rules. Okay, so it's highly instrumental. All right. So that being said, I am done with the lecture. You all did great. You're going to do great with the questions. Have a good rest of your day. Okay, be safe.